Sam Ward stood at his window, his rough palms resting on the sill as he watched the dusk settle. 45 winters had passed through him, and this one felt the longest yet. His beard was going white at the chin, and his shoulders carried grief like it had weight, which it did. 3 years ago, he'd buried his wife beneath a cottonwood tree that bent toward the creek like it too had broken in two. Since then, Sam had lived in silence, not because he couldn't speak, but because there was no one worth speaking to. The cabin bore the shape of her memory. Her woven shawl still hung on the back of the chair he never sat in. A shelf of dried herbs gathered dust, untouched since her hands last arranged them. He still slept on one side of the bed, though the other had long gone cold. There had been a child once, too, a daughter who'd never taken her first breath. After that, Sam stopped building cradles. He built fences, mended saddles, and kept to himself. The town whispered about the quiet man who rode in once a month and spoke only when coin changed hands. Some said he'd gone mad with grief. Some said he'd always been that way. That night, as the sky bruised into nightfall, he heard it, a sound not belonging to the wind. Faint, halting. He thought it might be a coyote at first, limping across the hard earth. But as he stepped out, shotgun in hand more from habit than threat, he saw her. She lay in the snow beneath the cedar by the barn, curled inward like the wind had carved her hollow. Her dress was torn at the sleeve, and blood soaked the fabric from shoulder to wrist. Barefoot, young, still as the deer he used to hunt in lean years. For a long moment, Sam simply looked at her, unmoving, the way a man stares at something he cannot believe is real. And then he lowered the gun. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask where she came from. He just lifted her with careful arms, as if afraid she might fall apart from a touch. She weighed less than sorrow and carried the scent of river water and smoke. When he crossed the threshold of the cabin, it felt like bringing a storm inside. He laid her near the hearth and wrapped her in the only blanket not steeped in memory. She stirred faintly, her lips dry and cracked, murmuring in a language he didn't speak but felt in his bones. Comanche, maybe. He hadn't seen any of their people near this land in years. Not since the soldiers came through and drove them out in the name of peace. But this girl, no more than 20, had the look of someone running from more than soldiers. He poured a basin of warm water and gently washed the blood from her skin. There was a gash on her arm, deep but not fatal. It had bled enough to weaken her, but the wound was clean. He stitched it with the quiet skill of a man who had once done this for a living, before the war, before the farm, before everything. She watched him through half-lidded eyes, flinching only once when the needle met flesh. He said nothing. She said nothing back. When he finished, he stepped outside to wash his hands in snow and let the wind clear the weight from his lungs. The moon was rising, casting long shadows on the prairie. He stared at the cedar tree for a long time. It had once been his wife's favorite. She'd planted wildflowers around its base every spring. They never came back after she died. Inside, the girl had curled closer to the fire, asleep now. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Sam stood in the doorway for a while, one hand on the frame, then moved to his chair by the fire and sat. He didn't try to sleep. He didn't watch her either. He just stared at the flames and remembered the last time he'd shared this room with someone else's breath. He told himself she'd be gone by morning. But morning came, and she remained. She woke before the sun did, sitting upright with a sharpness born of fear. Sam had left a piece of cornbread and some jerky on a plate beside her. She reached for it like a trapped animal might, quick, cautious. He sat at the table, drinking coffee, not watching her, but not ignoring her either. When her eyes met his, there was no demand in them, no plea, no gratitude. Just an uneasy truce between strangers. "You're safe here," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "For now." She didn't answer, but she didn't run. The snow thickened that day. Sam tended the livestock, checking fences and breaking the ice in the water trough. He worked slow, methodical as always. When he returned, she had swept the hearth clean and folded the blanket. He noticed her watching the cupboard, the shelves of dried goods. Hunger was a silent thing, but it carved lines in the face just the same. He made a stew that night, beans, salt pork, wild onion. She ate slowly, her movements precise, almost ceremonial. He noticed how she chewed only one side of her mouth and suspected a bruise on the other, hidden beneath her dark hair. He didn't ask who had hurt her. She didn't offer. That night, the storm worsened. The wind howled like a thing grieving its own voice. Sam stoked the fire and gave her the bed. He slept in the chair. It was not a kindness, he told himself. Just practicality. The bed was warmer. She was healing. That was all. In the middle of the night, he woke to find her standing at the window. Her silhouette was sharp against the firelight, her eyes scanning the horizon, watching for something, or someone. He rose slowly. "You expecting trouble?" She turned to him, then really looked at him. There was a long silence, heavy and fragile. Then she nodded. Once. Sam considered that. He had known trouble in many forms: war, hunger, loss. But this felt different. This was not his trouble, yet somehow it had already made its home in his life. He crossed the room and pulled a blanket from a chair. "You'll stay tonight. We'll figure out the rest come morning." She looked at him with something unreadable. Not trust. Not yet. But not fear either. He returned to his chair, leaned his head back, and listened to the crackle of the fire as the wind beat against the walls. Something in him had shifted, though he couldn't name it. The silence no longer felt like morning. When dawn bled through the shutters, pink and pale, Sam stepped outside to feed the horses. He hadn't seen fresh tracks in weeks, but this morning his breath caught. Hoofprints. Dozens. Circling the cabin like a noose. He looked to the ridge and saw them. Riders. Dozens. Maybe more. Painted faces. Spears tipped with sunlight. A figure at their head sat tall in his saddle, cloak whipping like wings. Comanche. Sam's chest tightened, not with fear, but with a cold clarity. He turned slowly back to the house. Inside, the girl stood near the fire, her eyes wide but not surprised. He said nothing. Neither did she. And in that stillness, something passed between them. A quiet understanding that neither was safe, but neither would run. Not anymore. The morning light rose slow and bruised, casting long pink streaks across the snow-covered plains. The air was brittle with cold, sharp enough to sting the lungs, and still enough that every sound carried far. Sam Ward stood outside, one hand on the fence rail, the other holding a dented tin cup of coffee gone lukewarm. He sipped without tasting, his eyes tracking a change in the horizon. He'd been a rancher long enough to know when the world went quiet in the wrong way. The birds hadn't called. No rabbits darted from underbrush. Even the wind had stilled, like the land itself held its breath. Then came the shimmer, barely visible at first. A ripple in the distance. Dust unsettled. The sound came next, the low rhythmic thunder of hooves. He didn't move, not at first. He set the cup down on the fence post with care, as if afraid to wake something ancient. Then he turned and walked toward the cabin, his boots crunching softly in the frostbitten snow. Inside, the girl was standing at the hearth, wrapping a strip of linen tighter around her healing arm. Her hair had been braided back loosely, and there was an alertness in her posture now, not fear, but readiness. "They're here," Sam said. She looked up, and her eyes, already wide, grew distant. He reached for the Winchester above the door, but didn't take it down. His hand paused, then dropped. The rifle wouldn't help him now. He stepped outside again, and this time she followed. The horses came into full view then, cresting the low ridge like a wave of earth and bone and motion. There were dozens, 60, 70 maybe, all mounted, all silent. Their approach was deliberate, not a charge, but a claim. They rode as one, their formation tight and unervingly quiet, the snow muffling even the hoofbeats. At their head was a man draped in a cloak made of black wolf fur, his face painted with streaks of red that ran like war tears down his cheeks. His horse was the only one adorned with feathers, braided into its mane and tail, each one stained with ochre and ash. His expression was unreadable, carved from old stone and darker knowledge. He stopped a dozen yards from the cabin, and the others formed a wide, circling ring behind him, surrounding the house without raising a single weapon. The girl stepped forward before Sam could speak. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "Father," she said. The man on the horse said nothing. His gaze passed over her, then landed on Sam. Sam remained still, arms loose at his sides, feet planted. He didn't speak. There was no point in explaining something neither man had words for. He only watched, trying to understand what this father saw. A broken-spirited white man with a cabin full of ghosts, standing next to his only daughter. The silence dragged long enough for the wind to return, brushing along the edges of the gathering like a breath, trying to revive a fire. Then the father spoke, his voice a low, solemn rumble. "You sheltered her." It wasn't a question. Sam gave a slow nod. The Comanche leader dismounted, snow creaking beneath his boots. He walked forward with calm authority, the way some men walked into battle or prayer. When he stopped, he was only a few paces from Sam, close enough to strike, close enough to see the lines of sleeplessness etched into each other's faces. The girl stepped between them. She chose not to return, she said quietly, but with a kind of certainty that needed no raising. The warriors didn't move, nor did Sam. The father's eyes, dark and ancient, flicked toward his daughter, then back to Sam. "She crossed into death," he said, "and you gave her breath again." "I didn't give her anything," Sam answered. "She took it back herself." The girl's father studied him for a long moment, something shifting, not softening, but recalibrating. A measure of the man before him. His hand rose slowly. Sam tensed, but it was only to touch the girl's chin. "You are not a child," he said to her, "and still I hope to decide for you." She didn't flinch. "I did not run from you. I ran from men who took more than they had a right to." That hit the air like thunder without sound. The leader looked away then, toward the open prairie behind Sam's homestead. The past stretched out there, tangled with blood, treaty, silence, and sorrow. He turned back to Sam. "My warriors will not strike today." Relief, subtle and swift, passed through the girl's shoulders, but Sam didn't relax. He heard the unsaid part. "But they may return," the father continued. "Not in peace. You have 3 days. Then I come not as a father, but as a chief." He mounted again in a fluid movement. No dramatic turn. No shouted command. The circle of warriors slowly turned with him, their horses moving like tidewater pulled by an unseen moon. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving only churned snow and the thud of retreating hooves behind. Sam stood watching until even the last silhouette vanished into horizon haze. He exhaled then, not deeply, just enough to feel the breath leave his body. Inside, the cabin had grown cold. The fire had dipped low. He tossed more wood onto it, sparks jumping like startled birds. The girl sat at the edge of the bed now, her face unreadable. "You should go with them," Sam said, not unkindly. She looked up. "And go where? Back to silence? Back to marrying some man who sees me only as a name on a treaty?" He had no answer. She added almost softly, "You gave me a room that didn't lock. That was enough." He busied himself with the fire again, not because it needed tending, but because he couldn't look at her too long without feeling something shift beneath the skin. He didn't know what to do with it yet. 3 days. He counted them like grains in an hourglass, each one a chance to lose her or keep her. Later that evening, as the wind howled across the chimney mouth, Sam sat by the window, a mug in his hand and his heart wandering too close to places he'd long avoided. She was across the room, weaving a strip of leather into something that might become a pouch or might become a story. Her hands moved with purpose, like she'd done this all her life, like making something new was a quiet way of reclaiming something old. He watched her from the corner of his eye, not out of desire, not yet, but out of wonder. Of all the people to find his doorstep, why her? Why now? She caught him watching, didn't smile, didn't look away. "You don't fear them," she said. "No." "Why?" "I've already lost what most men fear to lose." She nodded slowly. "I have not. But I've nearly." The fire snapped. Outside, a coyote yipped in the distance. Sam looked toward the sound, but said nothing. "I won't ask you to keep me," she said, voice low. but I won't leave unless you make me." He looked at her then, really looked. She wasn't soft in the way his wife had been. She didn't carry lightness or easy laughter. She carried storm silence and the stubborn root of something growing in scorched ground. He didn't tell her to leave. He didn't say she could stay. He just stood and stoked the fire again, and she returned to her weaving, and the world turned one breath closer to whatever came next. Outside, the tracks of 70 horses remained etched into the snow, a warning, a promise, or perhaps a mark left by fate's own hand. And somewhere in Sam's chest, something long dormant began to stir, quiet as the wind before it sings. The next morning arrived muted and pale, a sky the color of linen stretched thin over the horizon. The snow hadn't melted, but it had softened, the brittle edge of winter momentarily dulled. Sam Ward stepped out into the hush, the weight of the Comanche chief's words like stones in his coat pocket. 2 days remained. He busied himself in the way of men who have more thoughts than they know what to do with. Feed the horse. Check the tack. Mend the coop wire. The girl moved through the cabin like a ghost turned tangible, her touch light, her steps careful, but never timid. He noticed how she took to small tasks without being asked. She swept the hearth, cleaned his tin plates, folded blankets, and once, after dusk, refilled the woodpile with an armful she'd gathered herself. They still spoke little. Words between them were chosen sparingly, like water in drought. But the silence had changed. It was no longer a wall. It was something softer, a room both of them stood inside. She asked for his wife's name. That was the first time her voice came with intention. "Marjorie," Sam said, quiet as snow falling. She didn't say more. But later that day, he noticed she placed the old shawl, the one Marjorie used to wear while baking, neatly folded at the foot of the bed. She'd taken the one from the back of the chair instead. He watched her more now, not with hunger or heat, but with a steady, unsettled curiosity. The girl was younger than the years written into her eyes. There was a silence in her, yes, but it wasn't empty. It was shaped like someone who had listened long before she was ever allowed to speak. She had a way of watching animals that reminded him of Marjorie, head tilted slightly, like trying to understand their language. One morning, he found her crouched near the coop, holding out a scrap of biscuit to the hen who'd once pecked his palm raw. The bird took it gently from her hand. He passed her a length of leather later that day, supple and sun-darkened, and said, "Thought you might want to make something from it." She nodded, then looked him in the eye and said, "Thank you." The words landed softly, but with weight. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, close but never touching. She sang once, not loudly, not for him. A low lullaby in Comanche, full of sand and wind and smoke. He didn't ask what the words meant. Some things were not meant to be translated. Instead, he listened. He began to speak again, piece by piece. Not stories, not yet. Just fragments. She learned he had once been a medic in the war, the one where brother turned on brother, and fields bloomed red. He told her he came west not for gold, but because the silence here suited him. She asked no questions, and he liked that about her. One evening, as dusk bruised the edge of the sky, he returned from town with supplies. Miss Lottie, the storekeep, had eyed him strangely when he bought fabric and tea. Her mouth had pursed when he asked for an extra tin cup. "You've got company, Sam?" she asked, her tone sharper than the question warranted. "I've got someone passing through," he replied. She squinted. "Company's not always good company." "She's not trouble," he said. "She's a Comanche girl," Lottie whispered, as though the word might curdle if spoken aloud. "They've got a way of turning even quiet men wild." Sam had paid and left without another word. That night, he brought out the fabric and laid it on the table without fanfare. The girl looked at it for a long time before reaching out and touching it. Just a faint brush of her fingers over the blue cotton. She didn't speak, but her expression held something close to gratitude. The next morning, he found her stitching it into a tunic, handwork, so precise it could have been done by a machine. She worked by the fire, sunlight glinting off the needle. She looked calm, but her eyes flicked often to the window. Sam noticed. "You expecting them back before tomorrow?" She nodded. "They won't wait." He didn't ask if she was afraid. Later, As the wind picked up and the clouds rolled in low, Sam saddled his mare and rode to the canyon ridge that overlooked the trail. He saw nothing, not yet, but he felt it. The weight of what was coming. The tension in the air had teeth. When he returned, the cabin smelled of broth. She'd used what he brought, dried beans, carrot, a strip of pork. She gestured for him to sit, ladled out 2 bowls, and placed them on the table. It was the first time they shared a meal that felt like communion rather than survival. Afterward, he stood beside the hearth, watching the fire chew its way through kindling. She stood behind him. Not close, not touching, but there. "I dreamed of a river last night," she said. "Back home. I was small again. My mother washed my hair in the shallows. I hadn't thought of her in years." He turned just slightly. "She gone." She nodded. "Sick in the winter. No medicine." His throat worked around words that never came. "You remind me of her," she said. "You listen the way she did. Like every silence is a sentence you're still learning to read." He didn't know what to do with that, so he said what he could. "You're not what I expected. Neither are you." They didn't speak after that. But something opened. Something shifted. The next day, he showed her how to shape rawhide into reins, how to knot them strong enough to hold against a pulling horse. She taught him a different kind of knot, the kind used to bind sinew to arrow shafts. They worked beside one another in the yard as wind curled between them, scattering curls of hay and snow. It felt like building something. It felt like language. That evening, she braided his horse's mane, humming under her breath. He watched her hands, watched the way her fingers moved, nimble, precise, deliberate. She looked up once, catching him staring, and smiled. Just the smallest curve of her lips. It undid something in him. She stayed by the fire longer that night. He didn't ask her to, but he didn't move either. When she leaned her head against the edge of his chair, her hair brushing his arm, he didn't pull away. They sat like that, 2 shadows stitched together by warmth. He wanted to speak. He wanted to say, "I don't know what this is, but it's more than silence." He wanted to tell her about the dreams he'd started having again, of holding his daughter, of Marjorie laughing in the spring wind. But he didn't. The next morning, there were tracks in the snow again. Not near the house. Not yet. But close enough. The time had narrowed. He watched her from the porch. She stood by the cedar tree, hand on its trunk, her eyes closed. She looked like someone saying goodbye. "You think they'll take you?" he asked when she came back inside. "They'll try. I could leave. Ride with you. Get you past the ridge." She shook her head. "You run. They'll chase harder. They'll think you took me." That it was about conquest, not choice. His jaw clenched. "And if I tell them otherwise? They won't believe you. Not at first. You're not one of them. You're not one of us." He stared at her, the fire crackling behind him. "Then who are we?" She looked at him, and her eyes, dark, fierce, wounded, held something tender. "Maybe we're the language between." That night, the storm came again, but not with snow. With wind and dust, and a sky full of restless clouds. They sat close by the fire, knees nearly touching, breath sinking in slow rhythm. He told her then, finally, about his daughter, about the tiny grave beneath the cottonwood, and how he couldn't bring himself to name her, because naming something meant believing it had lived. She took his hand, held it. Her fingers were rougher than Marjorie's had been, but warmer, stronger. "I think she lived," she said, "even if only in your dreams." He couldn't answer. He wanted to kiss her, but didn't. Not yet. The moment asked only for nearness. They slept in the same room that night, him in the chair, her on the bed, but neither of them truly slept. The air was too full waiting. In the dark he whispered, "What's your name?" "Nahili." He tasted it. Let it settle on his tongue. Nahili. She breathed in like she hadn't heard it said like that in years. Outside, the wind shifted, and morning, the final morning, waited just beyond the edge of sleep. The morning broke without color, a sky stretched thin with ash and wind. The land had changed overnight. It no longer felt like a quiet place. It felt like a drum's skin stretched too tight, ready to snap. The air was restless. each gust tugging at the corners of the world, like unseen hands testing for weakness. Sam stood at the edge of the porch, a worn wool blanket around his shoulders, his eyes fixed on the horizon. There was no need to guess anymore. The Comanche would return today. The line had been drawn, not with words but with silence, with hooves that circled a home and eyes that burned without ever raising a voice. Inside, Nahili moved with slow precision, her face unreadable. She braided her hair back tightly, tied her tunic with leather cord, and checked the stitching along the bandage on her arm. She dressed not as a girl waiting to be rescued, but as someone bracing for what would come, whatever form it took. Sam watched her through the doorway. He wanted to ask her what she planned to do, but part of him already knew. She hadn't come here for safety. She'd stayed for freedom. And now that the choice stood sharpened and waiting, she would face it, not flee from it. He made coffee, though his hands shook just enough to spill a few drops across the counter. She joined him at the table, and for a time they just sat, two people surrounded by quiet, trying to memorize the stillness before it vanished. She spoke first. "They will want me to return, not just because I am daughter to a chief, but because I left without permission. They see me as belonging." "You don't," Sam said softly, "belong to anyone." Her eyes met his. "That is not how they see it. A woman taken or sheltered is a woman claimed. They will not ask why you helped me. They will assume they already know." He looked down at his calloused hands. "Then we tell them. They may not listen. Then we make them." She looked at him as if seeing something deeper beneath his quiet, not stubbornness, but resolve forged from sorrow. She reached across the table and placed her fingers over his. They stayed there for a long time. By noon, the clouds had gathered thick and low, swelling with a storm that had no name. The wind dragged dust across the ground in curls, whispering warnings against the cabin walls. The first rumble of thunder didn't come from the sky. It came from the earth, the hooves returning. Sam stepped outside again. He had oiled the rifle that morning, but left it leaning inside the door. It wouldn't help him today. This was not a fight of bullets or steel. This was something older. The horses came in tighter this time. No circle. Just a line across the field. A wall of riders dressed in war paint and silence. At their center stood Chief Navo, his wolf-cloaked shoulders broad as ever, but his expression drawn. His gaze found Nahili as soon as she stepped outside. She did not hide behind Sam. She stood beside him, eyes steady, spine straight. Navo raised a hand, and the warriors behind him dismounted. Still no weapons drawn, but the weight of intention hung heavy, as thick as the storm clouds above. "You have had your days," Navo said. "Now she returns." "She is not property," Sam replied. "She is daughter," Navo answered. "That is not ownership. That is bond. And when a bond is broken, something dies." Nahili took a step forward. Her voice was steady, each word deliberate. "Then let it die if it was built on silence." That caused a murmur among the warriors. Navo's jaw tensed. "You speak like one who forgets blood. I speak like one who has seen what happens when blood is all that binds." Navo approached now, his eyes burning into hers. "You would stay with a man who does not know our ways, who cannot speak to our dead, who will never walk the path you were born into." "I would stay with a man who let me be," she said, "who saw me before he needed me to be anything." Navo's eyes turned to Sam, and for a long, drawn moment, father and widower stood again in that unspoken crossing. No man raised his voice. No man moved. "You took her," Navo said. "I opened a door," Sam answered. "She walked through it. You love her." The words settled in the space between wind and silence. Sam looked to Nahili, and then back. "I lost everything I loved. And still, I wouldn't ask her to stay unless she wanted to." Navo turned his face slightly, as if listening for something else beneath the words. Then, slowly, he unhooked a blade from his belt, a ceremonial knife, old and etched with weathered carvings. He stepped forward and held it out, not as threat, but as offering. "A man does not win a daughter," he said. "He proves whether he will break under her weight or carry it with honor." Sam looked at the knife, but didn't take it. Navo continued, "We have a right. You will hunt with me. One deer, one path. If you walk it without flinching, then I will know what kind of man you are." Sam said nothing for a moment, then nodded once. Nahili touched his hand as he turned to go, her grip neither desperate nor pleading, just warm, present. The men rode out together, chief and rancher, into the low hills, where the sagebrush grew thick and the trees broke the wind. The deer they found was not old, nor young, a buck with eyes wide and ears keen. Navo motioned to Sam, offering him the chance. Sam took the bow, the same one Nahili had strung days earlier, and moved through the brush like he had during war. He did not rush. He did not force the moment. When he loosed the arrow, it struck just behind the shoulder, clean and true. They brought the deer back as the rain finally began to fall, not hard, but steady, like something long held back had been released. The warriors stood waiting, their expressions unreadable. Navo dismounted and stood before Sam again. "You do not speak like us," he said. "You do not know our words, but your actions say what your mouth does not." Then, without ceremony, he turned to Nahili. "You are no longer of my fire," he said, "but you are not gone from my heart." He touched her forehead with 2 fingers, then turned and walked to his horse. The warriors mounted. No battle came. No blood spilled. Just departure. Just rain. When the sound of hooves faded again into the waiting horizon, Sam and Nahili stood alone in the quiet. The storm did not howl. It wept. They entered the cabin in silence. She removed her wet tunic and wrapped herself in one of Marjorie's old shawls, and he hung his coat to dry. The fire hissed where the logs were damp, but the warmth held steady. She approached him slowly, her hands bare, her eyes raw. "You didn't flinch," she said. "Didn't know I had the choice. I was ready to leave. I would have let you." She stepped closer, and he let her. There was no trembling now, no breath held back. "I want to stay," she said. He reached out, touched her cheek. Her skin was damp from the rain, but warm. "Then stay," he said, as if there was nothing else in the world more simple or more sacred. And in that moment, the storm passed. Later, he would remember the way the rain hit the roof like a lullaby, and how her fingers found his knot in urgency, but in quiet trust. They did not speak of forever. They spoke only in touches, in glances, in breaths shared beneath the shadow of thunderclouds now drifting away. Outside, the tracks of the horses filled slowly with water. The fire inside crackled. And the 2 people who had been lost, not from the world, but from themselves, began to root again, together, in soil softened by rain. The sun rose slow and honey gold, warming the frost that clung to the tall prairie grass. For the first time in weeks, the sky was clear, blue as a newborn's eyes, wide as a breath long held and finally let go. The storm had passed, not only in the sky, but between them. The wind had stilled. The danger was gone. Sam Ward stood by the barn with a bucket in one hand and a worn bridle slung over his shoulder. His coat was patched at the elbows and speckled with hay, but his posture had shifted, less like a man weighed down and more like a man rooted. Behind him, the cabin no longer looked like a tomb. Smoke rose from the chimney in a clean, steady ribbon. Inside, Nahili moved through the morning light, barefoot, her hair braided down her back in a single dark rope. She didn't hum as she worked. That wasn't her way. But there was rhythm in her now, a kind of steadiness that hadn't been there before. She chopped herbs, folded linen, and carried water without hesitation. Each movement was her own, chosen freely. There was no fear in her hands anymore. Sam watched her from the window as she spread a blanket out to dry. The shawl she wore was no longer his wife's. It had been stitched with new edges, a strip of the blue cloth he'd bought in town sewn into the hem. Her creation now, her life woven in, the past respected, not replaced. He turned from the window and picked up the small bundle near the hearth. Inside it was a necklace, 3 carved bone beads on a leather thong, the kind his own mother had worn when he was a child. He held it for a long moment, thumb brushing over the center bead, before placing it carefully on the table where Nahili would find it. A gift, nothing grand, Just a gesture that said, "I see you. I choose you." Wordless offerings had become their language. Outside, the road stretched toward town, dusty and sunbaked now, its memory of snow fading. There was a matter that needed tending, one that couldn't be delayed. Sam saddled the horse, and Nahili stepped onto the porch, wrapping her shawl tighter. She said nothing at first, but her brow furrowed slightly. "You're riding into town," she said. He nodded. "They'll have questions about why the Comanche came and left without blood." She studied him. "You'll tell them." "I'll tell them what they need to hear." She looked past him toward the horizon. "They won't believe it. They'll believe what they want. They always do." A pause. "You want me to stay behind?" she asked, though her tone made it clear she wasn't afraid of following. Sam hesitated. "I want you to do what you choose." She looked at the horse, then back at him. "Then I choose to ride with you." He helped her mount, not out of chivalry, but because he wanted to. Her fingers brushed his wrist as she settled into the saddle, and he felt the charge of her trust. They rode side by side, the wind tugging gently at their coats, the hooves striking earth with a rhythm that felt like heartbeat and promise. As they neared town, Sam straightened his shoulders. He could already feel the weight of eyes. Townsfolk noticed things, especially when a Comanche woman rode in beside a man like him, quiet, scarred, too old for anything as foolish as hope. They dismounted outside Miss Lottie's store. She was already standing in the doorway, arms crossed, lips pressed thin. Her gaze went first to Nahili, then to Sam, then to the distance, as if trying to fit the pieces into a story she could live with. "Well," Lottie said, "you brought her back then." Sam met her stare. "She's not cargo, Lottie. Didn't say she was." The older woman's gaze flicked again to Nahili. "Though I don't think the good folk in town will take kindly to this arrangement." Nahili stepped forward before Sam could speak. Her voice was calm, but her words cut clean. "I am not an arrangement. I am a woman who chose." Lottie blinked. Something in her bristled, but she didn't reply. She only stepped aside as they entered. Inside, the store smelled of dust and cinnamon. A few townspeople paused their browsing. A hush spread like ink and water. Sam kept his chin up, hands loose at his sides. He didn't look to Nahili. He didn't need to. Her presence steadied him like earth beneath the wind. They picked up what they needed: flour, a bit of sugar, coffee beans. At the counter, Lottie rang up the goods in silence. Before they left, Sam said, "We'll be married come spring." The words were quiet, but every soul in the store heard them. A murmur ran through the room, like wind through dry grass. Nahili didn't flinch. She turned and walked out, leaving behind only the scent of sage from the bundle tied at her belt. Outside, Sam exhaled, not in relief, but in resolve. That had been the storm he'd feared more than any blade or bullet, the storm of judgment, of whispers, of history trying to claim them. But it hadn't won. They rode home slow, the sun lowering behind them in gold and rust. A hawk circled overhead, wings wide against the light. Nahili tilted her face to the wind. Her eyes were distant, but not lost. When they reached the cabin, the light was deep amber. Sam unsaddled the horse while Nahili walked to the cedar tree, fingers trailing along its trunk. The same one she'd collapsed beneath weeks ago. The same one that had marked a kind of death. Now it stood at the edge of something entirely different. That night, the fire burned low and rich. Nahili sat at the table, fingers working a new braid into a length of leather, the ends looped for reins. Sam watched her from his chair, one boot resting on the hearthstone, a mug cradled in his hands. "Will you miss them?" he asked. She looked up. "My people." He nodded. She thought for a while. "Some. Not all. I miss who I was before they told me what I had to be." Sam stared into the fire. "I know that feeling." She stood, cross to him, and placed her hands on either side of his face. "You never told me what you wanted." He looked up at her, his eyes lined but steady. "I wanted peace. But I didn't know what that meant until you walked through my door." She kissed him then, not the tentative kind born of curiosity, or the fiery kind born of want. It was a kiss that settled into him, anchoring something that had floated too long. A kiss that made room for silence after. In the days that followed, they built a new rhythm. She began carving again, shapes into bone, into antler. He repaired the fence with her beside him, their hands brushing often. He taught her to shoot a rifle. She taught him to track rabbit by the way snow bent in footprints. They spoke often now, not because silence no longer served them, but because there was joy in sharing it too. The town's eyes softened over time. Not everyone, but some. Miss Lottie began setting aside fabric Nahili might like. A boy from the nearby farm asked her to show him how to weave arrow fletchings. The world didn't change overnight, but it bent quietly, like grass beneath new wind. One evening, Sam sat by the fire with a cradle in his lap. He carved it slow, careful, the same way he once had for a child who never opened her eyes. This one was different. This one was for the life blooming in the curve of Nahili's belly. She leaned against the doorway, watching him work, her hands cradling herself like a prayer already answered. "You're different," she said. He looked up. "How so?" "Lighter. Like your shadow doesn't cling so hard." He chuckled softly. "Might be because I don't carry it alone anymore." Outside, the stars spilled across the prairie sky, fierce and infinite. The fire crackled. The baby kicked. The man carved. And the woman who had been hunted and silenced and claimed stood unbroken, beloved, chosen. In the stillness between breaths, Sam whispered, "Some stories begin with fire, some with ash. But ours began the moment I opened that door." Nahili crossed to him, placed her hand over his heart, and whispered back, and I walked in. And so they remained, two quiet souls who had once lived in storms, now wrapped in firelight and building a life not of conquest, but of consent. Not of rescue, but of recognition. They had endured the long ride. They had made it home, together.